next question was regarding what we're seeing with the fentanyl crisis and with what we're seeing in Mexico with the cartels. And there's been a lot of concern with how to solve this challenge. And I kept asking myself, what would Professor Chomsky say? How can we really tackle this challenge? And if there has to be a solution, which one should it be? Should it be a military intervention, which I'm sure you wouldn't agree on, led by the US, or would it justify the killing of Americans? Would it justify us coming and helping the Mexican military cope with the cartels? Or how do you think we can solve the rising violence that's happening south of our border?
Well, let me give an unserious answer and a serious answer. There's a saying in Mexico, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that Mexico is too far from God and too close to the United States. Okay, since it's too close to the United States, adopt the U.S. way of dealing with these things. So in the United States, there is a major issue. The fossil fuel companies and the banks are destroying the possibilities for life on Earth. So how do we deal with it? We try to bribe them to be nicer people. You look at the recent so-called Inflation Act, basically a climate act. What it basically does is say, please, fossil fuel companies, be nicer. We'll pay you to be nicer. We'll give you incentives to be nicer. We'll offer you more fossil fuel fields to exploit. We'll give you subsidies. All right, so how should Mexico deal with the cartels? Bribe them. Say, here, we'll pay you off if you stop killing people. If you listen to the United States, it's too close to the United States. Why not try that? Of course, that's ludicrous. Is it more ludicrous than what we're doing here? No. Now let's talk to a serious answer. What's the source of the drug problem? It's in the United States. Where do the guns come from for the Mexican cartels? From where I'm sitting right now in Arizona. I don't know which end of a gun to hold, but I could go into a gun store, buy a rifle, hand it over to the local cartel representative. He can take it to Mexico and start murdering people. Problem is primarily in the United States. That's where the drug problem is. That's where the majority of the guns are coming from. So the problem has to be answered here. It's the criminalization of drugs and the harsh drug policies. Now, there's a history to this. In fact, it goes back to Richard Nixon, except that in his case, the Republican Party still hadn't moved off to total savagery. So Nixon did impose kind of drug laws, but they had a rational, humane element to them. One part of the drug laws was prevention and treatment. Now that's gone. There are studies, again, Rand Corporation, others have done studies on what ways work for cutting down drugs. Well, they studied just in terms of cost effectiveness. The least cost, the most effect. Turns out the most effective by far is prevention and treatment. Worse than that is criminalization. Put them in jail. Worse than that is border controls. The worst of all is chemical warfare, what we call fumigation. So destroy the crops in Colombia, including drugs, but all other crops as well. So you create insurgencies and terrorism and so on. That's the worst of all. That's the ranking. Now take a look at the funding. It's the opposite. Most funding goes to the worst. Least funding, in fact, practically none, goes to the best. Well, It's another form of class war. In fact, the drug war has been an effective way of removing what are sometimes called the dangerous classes. In fact, if you look back over the history of drugs, it's the way it's always been. Take prohibition, back in the, it was the Women's Temperance League and so on. But what was the powerful force behind it? Get rid of the dangerous people. The immigrants who hang around in bars, we don't like those people. If you were a rich banker living in Westchester County, you could get any kind of wine or liquor you wanted. If you were a poor immigrant in a bar in New York, you get arrested and thrown into jail. Well, what happened when Prohibition ended? The Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, had nothing to do. So they launched a huge propaganda campaign trying to show that marijuana was a killer. Senate hearings with lurid presentations, so-called doctors coming in talking about the hideous things that would happen to you if you smoked a joint and so on. Just happened that marijuana was being used by the dangerous classes, Harlem blacks, working class people. So let's go after marijuana. Let's make that the enemy. And then it's one after another. But I think Nixon was probably the last president to have had any semi-reasonable element in this drug program. So you want to solve the Mexican cartel problem, overcome the drug crisis in the United States, which is where it's coming to, and stop the crazed gun culture. There are hundreds of millions of guns in the United States. It's outlandish. The far-right Supreme Court has turned the Second Amendment into holy writ. You ask people what's in the Constitution, first thing they'll say is the Second Amendment in the modern form, the form that was created by Justice Antonin Scalia in 2008. Before that, the Second Amendment meant what it said. In order to have a well-regulated militia, don't restrict arms. Now it's changed. Clarence Thomas's view, Thomas's picture of the United States is a hateful, murderous society. His view is, look, you can't walk in the streets without having an armory. You need it because this is such a horrible society. That was the latest decision on the New York law to try to restrict guns on the street. No, everybody has to have lots of guns. A 6-year-old kid has to walk down the street with an assault rifle because who knows what will happen next. Well, when you create that kind of culture, you're going to be overflowing with guns. Schools are going to become one of the most dangerous places in the country, and it'll flow into Mexico, where the drug cartels are delighted to have a cheap source of guns. The actual figures we don't really know, but most studies show that at least the majority of the guns in Mexico come from the United States. Mexico itself has pretty tight gun laws. You can't just walk into a store and buy a gun, as you can where I live in Arizona. But with the United States right next door, not much in the way of border controls to the south. You can import guns, you can export drugs. Well, we know the answer, but it's here in the United States. Mexico itself can't do very much.